Garrett Bardsley. In the summer of 2004, a young Boy Scout named Garrett Bardsley walked a short distance back toward his campsite to change a pair of wet shoes. He never arrived. More than 20 years later, no trace of him has ever been found. Garrett Alexander Bardsley was born on July 24, 1992, in Utah, the youngest of 4 children. He was a 12-year-old student at Spanish Fork Middle School in the town of Elk Ridge, a quiet, apple-cheeked boy with straight, shoulder-length blonde hair and a gap between his front teeth. He was a member of the Boy Scouts of America, attached to the Salem 8th Ward, and he had passed wilderness training courses offered by the Park Council. The kind of boy who knew his way around the outdoors. On Thursday, August 19, 2004, Garrett accompanied his father, Kevin Bardsley, and a group of about 18 scouts and 6 or 7 adults on a camping trip high in the Uinta Mountains. Their destination was Kuberant Lake, a body of water nestled in a remote basin of the Uinta-Wasatch Cache National Forest, at an elevation of roughly 10,400 feet, surrounded by steep inclines and boulder fields. The word Kuberant is derived from the Ute language, meaning long. It was a beautiful, rugged, and deeply isolated place, reachable only by a long hike along a trail that branched off the lofty lake trail. What happens when a child is out of sight for only a few minutes? On Friday morning, around 8 o'clock, Garrett and his father hiked down to Kuberant Lake to fish. Garrett soaked his shoes, socks, and pants in the cold water and told his father he wanted to walk back to camp to change. He was last seen wearing a black hooded sweatshirt, red sweatpants, and Converse shoes. The campsite was close, only about 150 yards up the hill, an easy walk on a path he had already traveled. Kevin watched him start up the slope and then turned back to the fishing. It seemed like the safest thing in the world. But after about 20 minutes, a feeling of unease set in. His father walked up to the camp to check on him, and no one there had seen Garrett at all. He had left the lake, started up a short, familiar trail toward people who loved him, and simply vanished somewhere in between. How far can a boy get in 20 minutes? The search began almost immediately, with the adults and other scouts fanning out to check nearby trails and the dense woods. Within hours, the operation escalated under the coordination of Summit County Sheriff Dave Edmonds. By the next morning, a Utah Department of Public Safety helicopter was in the air. The search grew quickly into a massive operation, drawing in professional search and rescue units, Rocky Mountain rescue dog teams, and potentially up to 1,000 volunteers, many from the Bardsley family's close-knit community. They combed a 3-mile radius around the lake, working through dense forest, boulder-strewn terrain, and muddy, rain-soaked ground. But the mountains turned cruel. Temperatures dropped close to freezing, and rain and even snow swept across the high country, stripping away any scent trail before the dogs could work it effectively. For all that effort, searchers found almost nothing. The single possible clue was a damp Nike sock, balled up in a boulder field about half a mile from where Garrett was last seen. But then a searcher came forward and claimed the sock was his own. Just like that, the one tangible trace dissolved into uncertainty. Garrett's fishing pole was never found either. No footprints, no clothing, no personal belongings, nothing. Could a well-prepared scout really just disappear? Investigators came to believe the simplest and saddest answer, that Garrett somehow became disoriented on his way back to camp, wandered into the rugged wilderness, and died of exposure in the freezing conditions. There was never any evidence of an abduction or of foul play. And yet the family could not bring themselves to rule it out, holding on to the possibility that someone had taken him. The official search was called off after 9 days. But Kevin Bardsley refused to stop. He and groups of volunteers returned to the mountains 2 or 3 times each week until October, when the snows came, and then again the following year, organizing at least one final large-scale search effort. None of it turned up a single new clue. Years later, hope flickered briefly. The family appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show in November 2004, sharing Garrett's story with a national audience. A tip came in describing a possible sighting of a boy who resembled Garrett at a grocery store across the state line in Nevada. The county sheriff's office looked into it, but a detective said the odds it had actually been Garrett were very, very slim. Like every other lead, it went nowhere. Kevin Bardsley has spoken of his regret in the years since, saying that he wished he had never let Garrett walk back to camp alone. The Bardsley family channeled their grief into a foundation created in 2005 to help families of missing persons and improve search and rescue efforts. In memory of Garrett, who had dreamed of traveling to help others, the family raised nearly $17,000 to build an elementary school bearing his name in Ecuador. The foundation also established a database of search-trained volunteers who can be contacted almost immediately after someone goes missing in the Utah wilderness. More than 2 decades on, the case is still open and unsolved. His father once said simply that he has speculated, and he does not know where Garrett is. If he did, he would just end this. Garrett Bardsley walked toward safety and never reached it, and his case remains open to this day. The next disappearance is far more recent and stranger in its details. A woman who set out alone on a cross-country road trip and vanished from a quiet forest road in Arizona, leaving her car abandoned behind her. Chelsea Grimm. In the autumn of 2023, a young woman named Chelsea Grimm set out to drive across the country and never made it to her destination. Her car was found abandoned on a forest road in Arizona, and she has not been seen since. Chelsea was born on March 22, 1991, in Stamford, Connecticut. She studied psychology at Pace University and earned a master's degree in social work from New York University. She had worked as a 12th grade social worker for the New York City Department of Education before moving to San Diego in 2020, where she became a licensed associate clinical social worker, photographer, and artist. She described herself as spiritual and Buddhist and had endured the loss of a boyfriend in 2015. What turns a cross-country road trip into a vanishing? On September 24, 2023, Chelsea packed up her white 2019 Ford Escape SUV, loaded in her beloved pet bearded dragon named Roxy, and set out driving east from San Diego toward a wedding in Connecticut. Her parents, Stephen and Janet Grimm, had initially suggested she fly, but Chelsea wanted the adventure of the open road. A few days into the drive, Chelsea called her parents. She told them the trip was taking longer than expected and felt overwhelming, and that she planned to skip the wedding, camp for a few days in Arizona, and then head back to San Diego. Over the next days, her behavior grew harder to explain. She was seen at a motel in the small town of Seligman, appearing disoriented and trying to pay with euros instead of dollars. She was filmed on a Williams, Arizona, police officer's body camera in a cemetery, in tears, explaining that she had been photographing the graves of lost soldiers. The officer suggested she sleep at a Love's Travel stop for the night. Instead, Chelsea ventured into the Kaibab National Forest. On September 29th, 2 hunters spotted her on a forest road taking photographs. The next day, September 30th, a woodcutter saw her camping in her car on Forest Road 6. He spoke with her, and she told him she was fine. Around the same time, another hunter noticed her vehicle had 2 flat tires. He asked if she needed assistance. She declined, telling him someone was coming in 10 minutes to help. The hunter left, but returned shortly after. Chelsea was gone. Her vehicle was locked with her purse still inside. Then she was gone. Her parents reported her missing on October 4th, when days had passed without contact. On October 5th, the Coconino County Sheriff's Office located her white Ford Escape abandoned on Forest Service Road 6 in the Kaibab National Forest, roughly 12 miles west of Williams. Its 2 passenger side tires were shredded. Inside, investigators pieced together an unsettling picture. Her phone was gone. So were her wallet, her keys, her sleeping bag, clothing, and Roxy the bearded dragon. But her cherished camera, the tool of her art, was still in the vehicle. Her mother Janet would later say the camera was part of who Chelsea was, and she could not imagine her daughter leaving the car without it. Search teams with dogs combed a 3-mile radius and found no scent leading away. Her father Stephen noted there were reportedly no footprints heading off into the trees. So what happened to her? This is where the case splinters. The Coconino County Sheriff's Office has maintained there is no evidence of foul play. But Chelsea's family suspects something darker. Private investigator Justin Yentes gained access to her digital data and said the trail simply ends in the woods. Another investigator reviewed her photographs and believed they showed a person moving through a mental health crisis, suggesting Chelsea may have intended to disappear. That same review also found surveillance footage contradicting the official timeline and a store clerk who remembered her arriving in a different vehicle. Could she have walked away on purpose? It is one real possibility among several, and none of them can be confirmed. She had endured significant personal loss, and the strain of the long drive plainly weighed on her. Chelsea also has a very distinct tattoo of a vine on her left forearm that could help identify her. Whether she suffered a crisis and wandered into the wilderness, chose to vanish and rebuild her life unseen, or met with something far worse, the evidence has never been enough to say which. More than 2 years later, the case remains open and unresolved. The Grimm family hired private investigator Michael Lancaster of Arizona Investigative Associates, who has continued searching for clues, asking hunters in the area to keep their eyes open. Chelsea's parents have kept her face on billboards along Interstate 40 near Williams and launched poster campaigns across northern Arizona. Her father, Stephen, has called it a bad movie, except it is reality. The contradictions in her final days have never been reconciled into a single answer. Chelsea Grimm drove into the Arizona forest and was never seen again, and her disappearance is still unexplained. The next case may be the most heartbreaking on this entire list. A very little boy who vanished from a tiny, remote campsite while surrounded by the very people meant to be watching over him. Dior Coons Jr. Of all the cases on this list, the disappearance of Dior Coons Jr. may be the most painful and the most bitterly disputed. A toddler vanished from a tiny, remote campsite in Idaho, surrounded by his family, in the space of a short walk to a creek. More than a decade later, no one has been found and no one has been charged. Dior J. Coons Jr. was born on December 30th, 2012, in Idaho Falls. To his family, he was known as Little Man. In July of 2015, the family decided on a spur-of-the-moment camping trip. On July 9th, Dior and his parents drove roughly 125 miles northwest to Timber Creek Campground, a remote area near Leadore in Lemhi County. They were joined by the boy's great-grandfather, Robert Walton, and a friend of Walton's named Isaac Rainwand. The group arrived after dark. The campsite sat beside Timber Creek, not far from Stone Reservoir. The next morning, July 10th, the group had breakfast together. Rainwand would later recall seeing the little boy clumping happily around the campsite in a pair of oversized cowboy boots. How can a child vanish from the middle of a family campout? That is the question that has tormented this case for years. By the parents' account, they left Dior at the campsite with his great-grandfather while they went toward the creek. They believed Walton was watching the boy, while Walton apparently believed Dior was with his parents. When they returned a short time later, the boy was simply gone. Jessica Mitchell called 911 in the early afternoon, and the response was immediate. Over the next 48 hours, search and rescue teams scoured the area on foot, on horseback, on all-terrain vehicles, and from a helicopter. Divers went into Timber Creek and Stone Reservoir, removing every logjam they could find. By the third day, roughly 200 people had come to help, and in all of that effort, they found nothing at all. No footprints leading away, no clothing, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the child had evaporated from the spot. Could a toddler really wander off and leave no trace? It seemed almost impossible, and that impossibility is what turned the investigation in a darker direction. The terrain was difficult. The water was right there. And at first the natural assumption was an accident. Mitchell, Kuntz, Reinwand, and Walton were all interviewed by law enforcement and were described as cooperative from the beginning. Kuntz and Mitchell voluntarily took polygraph tests, and initially then-Sheriff Lynn Bowerman said investigators did not suspect foul play. But as the days passed with no discovery, suspicion began to settle closer to the campsite itself. In January of 2016, Bowerman took an extraordinary step. He publicly named Dior's parents as suspects in the case, telling the press they had been less than truthful in interviews and polygraph tests. He said their timeline kept changing, their movements kept changing, and their statements about Dior Jr. kept changing. It was a stunning development. And yet, crucially, no arrest was ever made and no charges were ever filed against anyone. The theories only multiplied from there. Philip Klein, a private investigator from Texas hired early in the case, concluded that Dior had been the victim of an accidental tragedy at the camp and alleged a cover-up by those present. His team reported that cadaver dogs had hit on 5 locations, including a site roughly 3/4 of a mile from the campground. Upon being evicted from their shared apartment, investigators were given access by the landlord and discovered a camouflage jacket and several toy cars that both parents had claimed were with their son at the time of his disappearance. The parents fiercely denied any involvement and took legal action against Klein, though those lawsuits were dismissed by the court multiple times. A later investigator, David Marshburn from North Carolina, came to the opposite view, clearing the parents and instead suggesting that Reinwand knew more than he was admitting. Reinwand has consistently denied any involvement. Kuntz's attorney stated in the strongest terms that his client had absolutely nothing to do with his son's disappearance. Former Sheriff Steve Penner, who later took over the case, estimates he has been to Timber Creek Campground over 100 times. He has said there are only 3 real possibilities. Dior was abducted by a stranger, there was foul play involving someone at the camp, or nature took him, meaning he wandered off and was not found. What does the evidence actually show? For years, almost nothing. Bones found near the site were sent to anthropologists and even to the FBI lab in Quantico, but every time they turned out to belong to animals. Then Marshburn, searching a steep ridge above the campground, found a fleece jacket manufactured around 2014 or early 2015, bearing stains and marks consistent with animals. The jacket was turned over to the Idaho State Police Laboratory for DNA testing, but only a partial, low-level genetic profile could be recovered, not enough to draw any conclusion. Once again, a promising lead faded into uncertainty. Mitchell and Kuntz broke off their engagement shortly after their son's disappearance, each eventually remarrying and moving out of state. Robert Walton died in June of 2019. More than a decade on, Dior Kuntz Jr. is still missing, his case open, with no arrests and no charges filed. His mother has said that each of the 3,647 days since he vanished has felt the same, that the pain is still as real as day one. His grandmother, Trina Clegg, has written that the family still prays every day for an answer. Dior Kuntz remains missing, and his is the only case here with named persons of interest. The next case is older, and it triggered the largest search in the history of America's most visited national park, all for a young boy who slipped into the trees during a game. Dennis Martin. The disappearance of Dennis Martin is one of the most famous vanishings in American history, and it set off the largest search ever conducted in the country's most visited national park. In June of 1969, a young boy stepped into the trees during a children's game in the Great Smoky Mountains and was never seen again. Dennis Lloyd Martin was born on June 20th, 1962, in Knoxville, Tennessee, the youngest child of William and Violet Martin. He was a quiet boy with dark brown, wavy hair and long eyelashes, just 6 days short of his 7th birthday at the time of his disappearance. The Martin family had a long tradition of the male members camping in the Great Smoky Mountains for Father's Day. In June of 1969, Dennis went on his first overnight camping trip with his father William, his 9-year-old brother Douglas, and his grandfather Clyde. The park is the most visited national park in the United States, encompassing over 500,000 acres of ancient forest straddling the Tennessee-North Carolina border. The group entered through Cades Cove, hiked to Russell Field, and camped overnight. The next day, June 14th, they continued to Spence Field, a highland meadow along the ridgeline near the Appalachian Trail. There they met another family with children, and the boys came up with a small, innocent plan. What could go wrong with a harmless prank? The children decided to split up, slip through the trees, and jump out to startle the adults. Douglas and the other boys went one way. Dennis, wearing a bright red t-shirt and Oxford-type shoes, went the other way alone, heading northwest toward the tree line. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, when the other children leapt out, Dennis was not with them. He had walked into the woods and never walked back out. His father began calling within minutes, hurrying west along the trail for about a mile before doubling back. His grandfather Clyde hiked out to the ranger station, arriving around 8:30 that evening. How do you find one small child in a wilderness that vast? That evening, a heavy thunderstorm struck the mountains. It dropped 3 inches of rain in a matter of hours, flooding streams, washing out trails, and destroying any footprints or scent before trackers could ever follow them. Temperatures that night dropped to nearly 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Dangerous conditions for a small child with no shelter. By 5 in the morning on June 15th, the Park Service launched the search with an initial crew of about 30. 2 Huey helicopters were dispatched from Warner Robins Air Force Base in Georgia. What started as a few dozen swelled into a force of around 1,400 searchers, including park rangers, college students, firefighters, Boy Scouts, National Guard troops, and even Army Green Berets. Together, they combed more than 56 square miles of brutal terrain at a cost of approximately $50,000. It remains, to this very day, the single largest search the park has ever seen. The effort produced almost nothing. A set of child-sized footprints were found, including one barefoot print and one from an Oxford-type shoe matching what Dennis had been wearing. Retired park ranger and author Dwight McCarter, who participated in the search, believed these likely belonged to Dennis, since the tracks were not part of a group and none of the Boy Scouts had been searching barefoot. The tracks led to a stream where they disappeared. Park officials dismissed them, attributing them to a young scout. The enormous, uncoordinated crowd of volunteers was later blamed for trampling the very evidence that might have found Dennis. So what happened to Dennis Martin? The leading theory has always been the simplest and the saddest, that he became lost and disoriented in the rugged terrain, was caught in the cold and the rain, and did not survive. The park superintendent and the assistant chief ranger shared the personal opinion that if Dennis were ever found, he would be found within a few miles of the shelter where he was last seen. The area surrounding Spence Field is marked by steep slopes, deep ravines, and a dense, tangled forest that can swallow a person within a couple of footsteps. But the case attracted darker possibilities, too. A man named Harold Key, several miles away, reported hearing a terrible scream that afternoon. Shortly afterward, he and his family said they saw a rough, unkempt stranger moving through the woods, carrying something red over his shoulder, matching the color of Dennis's shirt. The boy's father came to believe Dennis had been abducted. The FBI investigated the family's background, found no enemies and no evidence of a kidnapping, and discounted the Key sighting because it had occurred roughly 5 to 9 miles from Spence Field by trail. a nearly impossible distance to cover in the available time. Key himself later speculated the man may have been a moonshiner. Could there have been remains out there all along? A few years later, a ginseng hunter claimed he had found the scattered bones of a small child in a hollow not far from Spence Field, but had stayed silent for years, afraid of being prosecuted for illegally harvesting the protected plant. By the time he finally came forward, confirming anything at all was impossible, and a renewed search of the area turned up nothing. The search was scaled back on June 26th and formally closed on September 14th, 1969. In October, a comprehensive review found that the park had failed to organize quickly enough and lacked a systematic plan for managing the enormous volunteer force. The sheer volume of searchers may have destroyed more evidence than they found. The Dennis Martin case became a landmark in search and rescue history, fundamentally changing how agencies approach missing persons cases in national parks and leading to formal protocols, including a discipline now called last known point behavior. The lengthy federal case file was finally released to the public in recent years after a campaign by author Tony Bouchard, who wrote a book on the case. That file documented the entire investigation without ever solving it. Dennis Martin vanished into the trees and was never recovered, more than half a century ago. The next case carries an eerily similar shape, but it unfolds far away in Yosemite, where a teenager walked a short distance ahead to photograph a mountain lake and stepped out of sight forever. Stacey Harris. In the summer of 1981, a teenage girl named Stacey Harris walked a short way ahead of her group to photograph a mountain lake in Yosemite. She was gone within sight of camp. And despite one of the largest searches in the park's history, she was never found. Stacey Ann Harris was 14 years old. She had come on a 4-day horseback trip into Yosemite's high country with her father, George, as part of a guided group of about 10 people. The trip began on July 17, 1981, at Tuolumne Meadows. After riding several miles, the group reached the Sunrise High Sierra Camp, perched at around 9,400 feet, the last camp on the 50-mile High Sierra Camp loop. The group settled into their cabins and freshened up after the long ride. Then Stacey picked up her camera and set off to photograph nearby Sunrise Lake. She invited her father to come along, but he declined. How far is too far for a short walk? She set off with Gerald, an elderly man from the group, roughly 71 or 72 years old. They walked downhill toward the lake, and the rest of the group watched them from the camp above. But before they had gone far, Gerald grew tired and sat down on a boulder to rest, while Stacey carried on ahead alone. According to the National Park Service, the trip's guide, working at the corral, looked up and noticed her standing on a rock roughly 50 yards south of the trail. He was, as far as anyone knows, the last person ever to see her. She walked down a granite slope toward the tree line surrounding the lake, disappeared behind some trees, and simply never came back. When Stacey failed to return, her father and the group raised the alarm. Over the following days, a search unfolded that ranks among the biggest in Yosemite's history, involving well over 100 people, teams of search dogs, and 3 helicopters. The search lasted approximately 11 days. What can vanish a girl in granite country? The High Sierra is a maze of granite slabs, ledges, and sudden drops. Searchers logged thousands of hours at a cost approaching $100,000. The only thing they ever found, by some accounts, was the small lens cap from Stacey's camera lying just inside the tree line. Even that detail is disputed. Could a teenager really leave no other trace? That absence of evidence is exactly what has kept the case alive for more than 4 decades. The most grounded explanation is that she wandered off the trail, became lost, and fell somewhere in the unforgiving granite. Others have wondered about foul play. Though Gerald's age and physical condition have made most observers skeptical, he was capable of harming a healthy teenager in rugged terrain. with a massive search beginning almost immediately. The case has become a cornerstone of a controversial framework popularized by researcher David Paulides, who collects strange disappearances in national parks. His work, featured on the Joe Rogan Experience and given a huge new audience through podcasts and documentaries, has drawn enormous attention to Stacy's story. It has also drawn sharp criticism. Mainstream outlets that have examined the supernatural theories tied to these cases have pointedly declined to verify them. What the renewed attention has not produced is an answer. One thing that has fueled the speculation is the sheer size of the case file. The Park Service has acknowledged that its records run to nearly 2,000 pages, an extraordinary volume for a missing persons case, and has declined to release most of it, citing law enforcement exemptions. Paulides was reportedly told bluntly that he would never get the case. To those convinced something is being hidden, that secrecy is proof. To the investigators, it is simply the paper trail of an exhaustive search that is never formally closed. More than 40 years later, Stacy Arras remains officially missing. No remains have ever been recovered, and the only possible trace she left behind was a single piece of her camera. Stacy Arras walked ahead to photograph the water and stepped out of sight, and the only thing ever found was a fragment of her camera. The next case takes us across the world to the mountains of Nepal, where a young American woman set out alone on a trek and vanished into a story that points, more than any other here, toward foul play. Aubrey Sacco was a young American artist and yoga teacher who had spent months traveling across Asia, keeping in near constant contact with her parents back in Colorado. In the spring of 2010, she set out alone on a trek through a national park in Nepal, and she walked into a disappearance that points, more than any other on this list, toward something sinister. Aubrey Caroline Sacco was 23, a recent graduate from the University of Colorado in psychology and art therapy. She was a violinist and free spirit who had traveled extensively through Sri Lanka and India, teaching yoga and English along the way. She carried a brightly colored lime green osprey backpack and kept in near constant contact with her parents, Paul and Connie Sacco, back in Greeley, Colorado. In April of 2010, Aubrey began a solo trek into Langtang National Park, north of Kathmandu, telling her parents the route through the Himalayan valley would take 7 to 10 days. Why does this case feel so different from the others? Because here, the trail does not simply vanish into wilderness. It leads toward people. On April 21st, Aubrey started her hike along a well-trodden trail through dense forests and over suspension bridges draped with prayer flags. She spent her first night at the Namaste guest house, where she met a young trekking guide named Tenzin Dorji Yonzan, who gave her a book called Ethnic Groups in Nepal as a gift. The next morning, she said goodbye to Tenzin and continued alone up the valley. She reached a lodge known as Lama Hotel, where she stopped to eat and met 3 young local men. Witnesses say the conversation initially seemed normal, but broke into a disagreement when the men told her the next stop was too far to reach that afternoon. Aubrey disagreed, pulling out her map and insisting they should stop lying to her. Her last confirmed sighting came on April 22nd, on a narrow stretch of trail near Goratabela, a Nepal army checkpoint. She walked past the soldiers and rounded a bend. She never reached her next stop, and she was never seen again. When she failed to return as planned, her mother Connie contacted the United States Embassy in Kathmandu. Embassy officials initially speculated that civil unrest, a Maoist uprising in the country, might have delayed Aubrey in the mountains. But the family was not reassured, and Aubrey's father Paul flew to Nepal to search. How do you search a mountain range on the other side of the world? With enormous difficulty and with growing dread. Paul, his brother-in-law, and a Nepali family friend spent about a month in the country, hiring a private search team and walking the trails day after day. The Nepali military, volunteers, and dogs combed the route, searching rivers, cliffs, and caves. Not a single piece of Aubrey's clothing, her conspicuous green backpack, or any personal item was found. The searchers noticed something troubling. The stretch of trail where Aubrey was last seen was not especially dangerous. As one person involved put it, a person would almost have to deliberately jump to fall from it, and even then might not reach the river below. The dogs found no trail veering toward the water. If she did not fall, then what happened to her? Suspicion hardened toward foul play, and a disturbing pattern came into focus. In 2005, 2 European women vanished 5 weeks apart in the area. Investigators found blood, clothing, and passport pages in a nearby hiking park, and police said they felt certain a serial killer was responsible. No killer was ever caught. In July of 2010, just months after Aubrey vanished, 3 French women reported being sexually assaulted by soldiers manning the Gora Tabela checkpoint, the very checkpoint Aubrey had passed. In separate incidents in 2011 and 2012, 2 more Western women were attacked in the same region. Then, in July of 2013, came the closest thing to a break the case has ever seen. After an undercover investigation, Nepali police arrested 3 men from the Langtang area. One of them reportedly confessed to an undercover officer, claiming Aubrey had been killed and her body and belongings thrown into a river. Items connected to her, including pieces of clothing, were said to have been found in the suspects' homes. The news of Aubrey's camera being recovered spread around the world. Could this finally be the answer? It was not. Within about a month, every one of the men was released, without charge. Police said the confession did not match the evidence. A photograph from Aubrey's own laptop reportedly showed a possible person of interest, but it led nowhere. And then, in 2015, a catastrophic earthquake triggered an avalanche that buried the entire Langtang village under tons of rock and ice, destroying the community where Aubrey had trekked and erasing whatever evidence the mountains might still have held. That disaster may well have closed the door on the case for good. More than 15 years later, Aubrey Sacco is still missing, her file kept open as a cold case in Colorado. Her family has never stopped maintaining a website in her name. Her father Paul channeled his grief into a 14-song album titled Finding Aubrey. Some tracks built from recordings Aubrey herself had made before leaving for Nepal. No remains have ever been found, and no one has ever been charged with harming her. Aubrey Sacco vanished on a trail that should have been safe, and the one confession in her case fell apart within weeks. The next case returns to Yosemite, to an experienced hiker who knew the backcountry intimately, and whose abandoned backpack only deepened the mystery of where exactly he had gone. Michael Faisery. Michael Faisery was not a careless tourist who wandered into danger. He was a seasoned backcountry hiker with about 30 years of experience, a man so sharp that friends said he had the memory of an elephant. He lived simply and off the grid, without a cell phone or a computer. And in the summer of 2005, he walked into the remote northwest corner of Yosemite and was never seen again. Michael Allen Faisery was born on March 30th, 1954, and grew up in Southern California. He attended the University of California, worked for the post office, and was 51 years old. 5'10", 165 pounds, physically fit, with shoulder-length gray hair, a gray beard, and eyeglasses. He spent his life surfing, cycling, and especially hiking. And friends described him as highly intelligent with a photographic memory. He had once broken his ankle deep in the backcountry and calmly crawled his way to safety. This was not a man who panicked easily. On Wednesday, June 15, 2005, Michael set out alone on a hike north of the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, one of the most remote sections of the park. He had planned a loop from Rancheria Falls to Tiltil Mountain to Lake Vernon, and then through Beehive. He was last seen wearing a faded blue t-shirt, olive green shorts, and a faded red scarf. Park rangers reported seeing him hiking by himself on that first day. What happens when even an expert disappears? At some point during the hike, Michael changed his plans. He veered off his intended loop route and turned up the Pacific Crest Trail toward Tiltil Mountain, a gradual trail that rises and falls without the extreme steepness found elsewhere in Yosemite. When he did not return home by Sunday, June 19th, the day his wilderness permit expired, his family grew concerned. On Tuesday, June 21st, they called the Park Service to report him missing, and a large search began. What they found only deepened the mystery. His backpack was discovered near Tiltil Mountain, just off the trail, at the edge of the snow line, on terrain officials described as extremely rugged and hazardous. It was well off the route he had originally planned to take. Inside the pack, searchers found his topographical map and a camera bag, but the camera itself was missing. Also missing was his distinctive gallon milk jug, labeled with his own name, that he used to carry water. Why would an experienced hiker leave his pack behind? That was the detail that chilled the people who knew him. Friends insisted Michael would never willingly abandon his backpack, the lifeline of any serious backcountry traveler. Its presence there on the rocks, with several key items removed, suggested he had walked away from it, fully intending to come back, perhaps only for a moment or two, to refill water or take a photograph, and then somehow could not. The search that followed was vast and extraordinarily expensive. It drew in teams from at least 5 counties, helicopters, dogs, and even United States Marines. The Park Service spent approximately $452,000 on the operation, one of the most costly searches in Yosemite's history. That year, Yosemite accounted for 1/4 of all search and rescue dollars spent across the entire national park system. And after all of that, they found nothing more. No body, no bones, no clothing, no camera. The backpack was the first and last real clue. So what became of Michael Feisery? The theories circle around that abandoned pack and the missing water jug. The most likely explanation, to many, is that he stepped down toward the creek or river below the snow line to refill his water, lost his footing on the icy, difficult ground, and was swept away or fell into terrain where his body would never be found. A simple, ordinary fall in that unforgiving landscape could account for the whole disappearance. But there is a darker theory. Some have speculated that Michael, traveling alone through a rarely patrolled stretch of wilderness, may have stumbled onto an illegal drug operation hidden in the backcountry. There has never been proof to support this, but the remoteness of the area has kept the idea alive. His sister came to a more grounded conclusion. She believed Michael was underprepared on that particular trip, carrying no signal mirror or whistle, and that he had deviated from his planned route into ground that proved too much even for a man of his experience. She started a small venture called Pack 6 to provide hikers with ready-made survival kits, so that others might carry the things Michael did not. More than 2 decades later, the case remains unsolved. A Michael Feisery has never been found. Michael Feisery left his backpack at the snow line and walked away from it, and no trace of the man was ever found. The final case on this list is the oldest of them all, a honeymoon adventure on the Colorado River nearly 100 years ago that ended with an empty boat drifting through the Grand Canyon and the 2 newlyweds gone. Glenn and Bessie Hyde. The oldest mystery on this list is also one of the most haunting. In the autumn of 1928, a pair of newlyweds set out to run the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon on their honeymoon. Their boat was eventually found, drifting and fully intact. Glenn and Bessie Hyde themselves were not. Glenn Rollin Hyde was born on December 9th, 1898, a farmer from Twin Falls, Idaho, who had traveled the Salmon and Snake Rivers with an experienced river runner known as Cap Goliki in 1926. His new wife, Bessie Louise Haley, born December 29, 1905, was a bohemian artist and poet from Parkersburg, West Virginia. The couple met in 1927 aboard a passenger ship to Los Angeles and married on April 10, 1928. One day after Bessie's divorce from her first husband was finalized, Glenn had a bold idea for their honeymoon. He would run the treacherous rapids of the Grand Canyon, making Bessie the first documented woman ever to complete the journey. Only about 45 people had ever accomplished it, and success would have brought them fame, book deals, and a lecture tour. What drives a couple to gamble their honeymoon on the deadliest river in America? Ambition and a touch of recklessness. Glenn built the vessel, a flat 20-foot wooden sweep scow they named Rain in the Face. On October 20th, 1928, the couple launched onto the Green River in Utah. Carrying no life jackets, heading for Needles, California. They successfully ran several dangerous canyons, though Glenn took a tumble into the water at one point. According to Bessie's detailed journal, they were ahead of schedule. On November 16th, roughly 26 days into the trip, the Hydes hiked up the Bright Angel Trail to the canyon's south rim to resupply. There they met Emery and Ellsworth Kolb, two brothers who were legendary photographers of the Grand Canyon and ran a cliffside studio. The Kolbs took what would become the last known photograph of the Hydes. Why would they refuse a life jacket on a river like that? It was a fatal kind of confidence. Emery Kolb asked the Hydes about their life preservers, and Glenn responded with an amused laugh, insisting they were unnecessary. Kolb noticed something else that troubled him. Bessie seemed hesitant, possibly weary or fearful of the rapids still ahead. Before climbing back down to the boat, Bessie looked at Kolb's young daughter in her outfit and said something eerily prescient. She wondered aloud if she would ever wear pretty shoes again. A photographer friend of the Kolbs, Adolphe G. Sutro, the grandson of a former mayor of San Francisco, joined the newlyweds for the first few miles of their continued journey. He parted ways with them near Hermit Rapid on November 18th. He was the last person ever to see Glenn and Bessie Hyde alive. After that, the canyon swallowed them. When the couple failed to reach Needles, California by early December, Glenn's father launched a search. A small airplane was enlisted, prompting one of the first aerial searches ever flown over the Grand Canyon. Just before Christmas, the search plane spotted their scow adrift around River Mile 237. When rescuers reached it, they found something deeply unsettling. The scow was upright and intact, its supplies still strapped neatly in place. There was food, clothing, books, and a camera. There was Bessie's journal, with her final entry dated November 30th near Diamond Creek. A camera revealed the final photograph had been taken near River Mile 165 on or about November 27th. Nothing hinted at the trip being cut short. Everything was there, everything except Glenn and Bessie. So what happened to the Hydes? The leading theory, argued by river historians including Otis R. Marston, is the most straightforward. Somewhere in a violent stretch of rapids near River Mile 232, the scow likely struck submerged rocks and pitched one or both of them into the freezing, churning water. Marston noted that this particular rapid contained pieces of granite wall lying submerged where they had damaged, snared, or capsized more boats than any other location in the canyon. Without life jackets, they would have had virtually no chance. The romantic version of the story holds that one of them fell in and the other leapt after, trying desperately to save them. But a mystery this old inevitably breeds legends, and the Hyde case has spawned some of the most enduring in river lore. Could one of them have survived? In 1971, an elderly woman on a commercial rafting trip announced around the campfire that she was Bessie Hyde, claiming she had stabbed Glenn during a quarrel and hiked out of the canyon alone. She later recanted entirely, telling a reporter she had never even heard of the Hydes. Years later, when legendary female river guide Georgie Clark died in 1992, Items found among her belongings led some to whisper that she had secretly been Bessie all along. Her birth certificate listed her real first name as Bessie, and a copy of the Hyde's marriage license and a pistol were found in her home. Colorado River historian Brad Dymock investigated the theory thoroughly in his book Sunk Without a Sound, and concluded the two women were simply not the same people. They did not even resemble each other, and Clark's early life was well documented. The items were most likely souvenirs. Even a skeleton discovered in 1976 on Emery Kolb's property, with a bullet inside the skull, was once suspected to be Glenn. Forensic analysis proved it belonged to a much younger man who died decades later. Every one of those legends has collapsed under scrutiny. What remains is the simple, stubborn fact at the center of it all. Nearly 100 years ago, two newlyweds rowed an open boat into the Grand Canyon, chasing a record and a dream. And somewhere in the rapids, they vanished, leaving behind only a perfectly intact boat, a half-written journal, and a mystery that has endured for nearly a century. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.